I'm going to kick off by reading from Ezra chapter 3 and from verse 10. And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites, the sons of Asaph, with cymbals to praise the Lord, according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever towards Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of the house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping, because the people shouted with a great shout, and the sound was heard far away. I guess for many of these people who had returned to Jerusalem, their city would have begun to fade from their memories had the horror of those final months of its siege not been burned into their psyches. Unwanted images of suffering, brutality, and slaughter tormented minds that craved peace. Their 60-year exile began with the city's destruction by the forces of Babylon, and at times those who were carried away envied those who had died. At least they had been buried in promised land. The prophets had promised that the exile would end. But as the years inched by, heavy loaded with the suffering of their rootless existence, their confidence in that hope began to fade. Will they ever see Jerusalem again? Will the exile ever end? Will we ever get to rebuild the temple? Will we ever again meet to worship the Lord in its courts? But now they were back in their homeland. Their feet once more walked on ground where Abraham had stood. Yet again, God had shown that he keeps his promises, and some 40-odd thousand Jews had made the long journey back with the intention of building a new Jerusalem with a new temple at its heart. It was, as we've read, a bittersweet experience for them, filled with the promise of the new, but also resurrecting long-buried memories of the old. For some, the laying of the foundations of the new temple was a new beginning. For others, it was a reminder of what they had lost. All were in agreement, though, that the new Jerusalem must be built around the new temple, because life in the new Judea must be formed and shaped by the worship of the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever towards Israel. The end of this COVID-19 pandemic is not in sight. Some minor aspects of the lockdown are being eased, but let's not get the idea that we're on the home straight. We're not. We'll be living with this virus for quite some time. But when the new normal does begin to take shape, the question we will all need to answer is, what sort of society do we want to see? At the moment, there's a lot of optimistic speculation about how things will change for the better and how a fairer society will have to emerge. But will the powerful devolve their power or use it for the good of others? Will the wealthy share their wealth? This virus has exposed once again the inequalities and injustices of our society. COVID-19 has hit the disadvantaged in our society much harder than it has the privileged. The death rate among the poor is twice as high as it is among the wealthy, and closely related to that fact, Black, Asian, minority ethnic people have suffered much more than have white Europeans. This on the back of the Windrush scandal, the Grenfell Tower fire, and a great deal of racist talk and sentiment that infected the Brexit debate. If racism is in our politics, then it's because it's in our workplaces, on our streets, in our homes, and in our churches. Continuing with this theme of injustice, it's reported that some financial traders are actually profiting from this disaster, having betted against the world's economy. It's also reported that some traders are profiteering through multiplying the prices they charge for essential goods. And it's even been highlighted that the shortage of PPE in hospitals and care homes has led to fraudsters setting up false websites, falsely claiming to sell this vital equipment in order to exploit those who are most at risk from the virus. And we are, of course, also witnessing great acts of love, acts of charity and compassion, acts of self-sacrifice, ingenuity, and acts of great generosity. And let's be in no doubt, this is where the future is inevitably going to be. You see, Jesus stood in this temple we've just read about and claimed that should its walls be torn down, then he would rebuild them in 3 days. He was, of course, referring to himself and to his resurrection. Basically, he's saying this, that through his resurrection, he is revealed as the new temple, the center and the heart of human society. This is what the future will be filled with. Society will be built around him, around his love, his compassion, his self-sacrifice, and his creativity. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could use this moment when this horrific experience of suffering, alienation, and exile comes to an end to move closer to the kind of society that reflects the lordship of Jesus? To reflect the fact that through his resurrection from the dead, Jesus is the beginning and the end of God's purposes in creation and in human society. Whatever changes are brought into our nation and to our communities, these need to be consistent with the resurrected life of Jesus, how society is structured, how labour is organised, how we use the world's resources, how wealth is distributed, how justice is administered, how we care for our climate, how we treat outsiders. In a sense, we've already had a dry run of this. After the 2008 financial crash, there was a lot of talk about rebuilding our society along fairer lines, but absolutely nothing came of it. Our courage failed us, and we retreated to the familiar structures and failed ideologies. The courage of this first generation that returned from Babylon also failed them. The construction of the temple stalled for 20 years. It was eventually built, but Jerusalem remained in ruins. It was fully 90 years after the end of the captivity that Nehemiah rebuilt the walls and got its institutions to function for the benefit of the people. So will the wrongs of our past be righted? Will this opportunity to build a better society be taken? Or will we hesitate once again, and once again return to the security of what is familiar, even if the familiar is filled with injustice? Will the powerful grasp their power more tightly? Will the wealthy stash their wealth with even greater neurotic energy? I've no doubt that they will try. But ultimately, the future doesn't belong to them. It belongs to the risen Christ and to his kingdom. This is the kind of new society we need to build, one that has Jesus at its center.